I mean, not me, but yeah.
Conversations with
That's nice. Okay, so I will reward all you prompt people by starting on time. We light our chalice in recognition of the wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. Now, there's a couple new faces here, so we'll go over the basics that we're going to be talking about tonight. Come on. So we're talking about the 6 sources of our living tradition, which in your hymnal are right under the 7 principles. These are part of the UUA's bylaws, and like the principles, they are reviewed every 20 years, I believe it is. There have been some changes made over the years, but it's part of the mandated process of the UUA that this is a reviewable document. So we're going through all 6 of them. This is the 3rd one. We've already covered transcending mystery and wonder. Last week we did words and deeds of prophetic people. So this week we're doing wisdom from the world's religions, which inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life. And each week I'm going to remind you of, and tonight this is most appropriate since this is from Hindu theology, the different ways of being religious. And as I'll discuss, this is actually an idea that we really got from Hinduism, that there's more than one way to be religious. And in Hindu philosophy, there are 4 distinct ways. Bhakti yoga being the quote-unquote lowest form, the one practiced by the most people, is a way of devotion. So maybe you have a shrine in your home, or there's a particular practice you do that on a daily basis. So it's just like the Stada Baba in the Chicago suburb with her saint cards and her rosary beads and all that. It's the way of devotion. Karma yoga is the way of right action. So people who live good lives by doing good deeds is a way of being religious. Jnana yoga is the way of reasoned inquiry, which is one we are obviously overstocked in our denomination. And then Raja yoga is the one we traditionally talk about, the pretzel bending and the meditation and all of that, where everything becomes one with the universe. So tonight, first of all, we've obviously got to narrow this topic down a little bit, because to talk about all the world religions in one hour and a half meeting is going to be almost impossible. So if we look at the world's major religions, this particular list is by number of adherents, with the exception of Judaism, which normally would be further down the list. So I've included them just in terms of impact of world religions. But since next week we're talking about Jewish and Christian teachings, we don't have to worry about Judaism and Christianity tonight. And in the last class, we'll be talking about earth-centered traditions, which is largely what would be taken up with indigenous religions like shamanism and animism and things like that. So we don't need to talk about that tonight. So we've whittled it down to this list. And for sake of brevity and I think most inclusiveness, I'm not going to get into Taoism and Shinto and anything smaller than that, because we got enough work to do with Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. So, Islam. And actually, I'm going to be making a distinction here by even doing Islam this week. We could arguably do it next week. And this is an issue that probably will come up. I know, Dennis, you had mentioned this to me in an email. Should Islam be mentioned specifically in our sources, since we mentioned Judaism and Christianity, and Islam is another Abrahamic religion?
Yes.
That's a worthy discussion point. And I would be surprised if somebody doesn't bring it up the next time they're reviewed. But for sake of tonight, because next week we're going to have more than enough to talk about, we'll cover Islam tonight. So when we talk about the influences of Islam on Unitarianism and Universalism, just some basic facts. Unitarians and Universalists have certainly been aware of Islam for centuries, really from its inception in the 7th century. When you get up to the 16th century, when all the fun starts happening with the Reformation, Michael Servetus, one of our earliest forebears, came from Spain, which is obviously a country that knew the Islamic faith well. So he was certainly well aware of it. John Adams and others in their letters wrote about what they were calling at that time the Mohammedans. I know Adams had some particular dealings with the Barbary pirates and the whole northern coast of Africa. So he was certainly aware, and others were certainly aware of the Islamic faith at that time. We have not only the Quran, but you also have, just like in Judaism, just like in Christianity, you've got other writings by people other than the original prophet or the original authors of the sacred book. The hadiths are innumerable. They do a lot of clarifying because obviously the Quran doesn't provide every answer to every question. So when one wants to look at influences, you really do need to look at the Quran and the hadiths, which is a lot of work. Now for us, UUs are very familiar in the news cycle with Sunni and Shiite Islam, which is by far 99% of Muslims. But we tend to focus more on the Sufis because we love Rumi, we love the mystical poetry, that sort of thing. So in one sense, we are perhaps a little over on one side than we should be. But I'll caution us too to say that just like Christianity, to say that all Christians are Methodists would be wrong. Well, to say all Muslims are Sunni or Shiite as if that's a well-defined boundary is wrong. There are obviously mystical Sunnis and mystical Shiites. One thing that does differentiate Islam from most other religions and makes it much more compatible with us is their commitment to justice. When you read the Quran, even casually, it is throughout the book. The constant need to have a just society for all people. And then this was another note I found in one of the articles that I was researching for this class. Although we tend to think of a Muslim as being someone who adheres to the organized religion of Islam, technically the word Muslim simply means someone who submits to the will of God. So anyone can be a Muslim. Christian, Jew, Unitarian Universalist. It's not necessarily interchangeable with the term Islam. Now, I found some articles that are good articles for those of you who are interested. I'm going to send everyone the links to these articles after the class. The one is an article that's written by a Muslim called Islam and Unitarians. So it's his point of view from the Islamic side. And then this one is written by a UU. This was published in the UU World in 2016. The Liberalism and Unitarianism of Islam. So these are both really good sources, good, interesting things to look at, and I will commend those to your reading at some future date. So what I want to talk about tonight in regards to Islam, if this will advance, there we go, are these two questions. Because the source is obviously very ambiguous. All these sources are phrased in a very ambiguous way. I mean, what the hell does it actually mean when we say, wisdom from this religion inspires us in our ethical and spiritual life? What does that even mean? So I guess my first question is, what wisdom would we say that we derive from Islam today? We know that Unitarians and Universalists have known about Islam for as long as it's existed. What influence has it had on us, on our theological development? And what wisdom, if any, do we derive from it today? And then the follow-up question will be, is there other wisdom that we could derive from this religion? And if there is, and we wanted to avail ourselves of it, what would it take to do that? Go, John. I can always count on John to break the ice.
The idea of justice is something that's probably innate to human beings. It seems to be prevalent amongst chimps. That's our closest. It pops up in every religion, I think, that's out there. And I don't know about Scientology, but anyway. So did we derive it from Islam, or did we just come up with it as all other religions do? One of the things that Islam stressed, and certainly we saw this in bringing the knowledge of the Greeks and the Romans to Europe, was a tremendous interest in science, literature, preserving all this in great libraries, advancing it, meeting with other the leaders of other religions to discuss these things. It wasn't that way all the time. So you have in every religion you have your authoritarian side who's going to you say it the way we say it, or you're not one of us, and that's the end of the story. So there's no discussion, there's no looking for new knowledge. But there was, particularly in Spain, from probably the 900s when they really started to flourish to close to 1492. That's when things all ended in Spain for the Muslims. And during that time, they brought that knowledge from Alexandria and other places that they had conquered, and it did move up into Europe and spread. It was like a precursor to the Renaissance, or maybe that was the real Renaissance. I don't know. So they have the good side, but like every religion, there's some nasty.
You could put the thing of the whole question of fasting and almsgiving is two different types of things which you're finding. You find that in most of those the types of things, a sense of self-control, of getting away from types of things, getting apart from the world itself.
Yeah, and I think the one distinction, and I'll put this forth, and you can comment on it, that distinguishes Islam from other religions in this particular venue is other religions tend to debate ad nauseum on how to practice the religion. By and large, Muslims totally agree on what the 5 pillars of Islam are. Charity is one of the 5 pillars. The pilgrimage is one. So there may be some disagreement on exactly how you wash your feet or something like that, but there's no disagreement on the basic premise of what is a well-lived religious life. Whereas Christianity certainly has many disagreements on that. If you get 10 Buddhists together, you're going to come up with 8 different ways of practicing Buddhism. And I think that's where the justice focus comes from. That there's not as much a sense that justice is ingrained in the religion, in other religions, as there is in Islam, since it is definitely one of the specifically targeted focuses of what being a believer is.
Well, that comes with the question of relationship of one person to another too. You know, that there is the thing of social consciousness, but also social responsibility.
Yes.
I think there's a distinction between Islam and most of the other religions. Really think it's probably true for you, is that for Islam, religion is not separate from the state. It is religion is not separate from state. It's absolutely, totally intertwined, or it's not being practiced properly. It is also the case, and there's an exception, if you're a Muslim living in another country, then it is your duty to take up the viewpoint of that country. But if you're in a country that's predominantly Muslim, then the whole religion infiltrates the government and governing. And I don't think that's quite the democracy kind of idea that.
Well, I'm gonna differ with you, John, and correct me if I'm wrong, which I don't need to say to you, obviously. I know you'll have no qualms about it. That's absolutely true of Sunni Islam. It couldn't be less true for Shiite. Shiite church and state are rigidly separate, which is not true of Judaism, Christianity, many other religions. You know, the history of Christianity is one of complete embeddedness of church and state.
Now, I was going to agree with John, and I still will, until you just tell me about a Shiite state or country where it's separated. I can't think of one.
Well, not now, but in the past.
Was that?
Not now, but maybe in the past. I mean, you can't look at Iran today and say it's separate. Maybe in the past.
And I was thinking along the terms of John is so often religions, and I think of Muslim is the culture, the politics, and the religion just kind of blend together. And I was also thinking one of my best bosses I ever had was Muslim. Talk about fear and concern and staff. And I've never had a boss. It was in Wyoming of all places.
Jeez. Fish out of water.
Wow. He had to travel 120 miles to worship.
You know, your first question up there had to do with wisdom. And I think the basic wisdom of Islam is the premise there's no God but God.
Right.
And then everything else goes from there.
And again, like in every religion, depending on who you talk to, a Muslim will say to a Christian, yeah, your God is my God. We don't disagree. We only disagree if you think you need to kill me because my God isn't, I don't call my God what you call your God. They recognize the Christian God
But
and the
there's
Jewish God.
certain Muslims who think in terms of the infidel who should be destroyed.
Right.
You know, that's so you've got different perspectives.
And generally those are going to be your Sunnis, because then they've got the state authority and run the military. I was looking up quick to see examples of Shiite nations. Shia Muslims are in the majority in Iran, Iraq, Bahrain, Azerbaijan, and according to some estimates, Afghanistan, India, Kuwait, Lebanon, Pakistan, Qatar, Syria, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and UAE. Now, and then other nations like Indonesia are much more, the morality is much more connected with the state.
But this also has to do with an understanding of what is the truth. So if there's one truth, well, then the state has to abide by that truth, and so does the religion. Almost kind of like the fundamentalist Christians, you know, they have,
Right.
you know, that if it's only one truth, one concept or one truth, then everything has to conform to that one truth.
Well, and the perfect example, of course, and all of us are old enough to remember, you know, when Iran was run by our puppets, you know, it was still an Islamic state, but complete separation of church and state, wild separation of church and state. When the Ayatollah Khomeini took over, complete merger of the two. Now, the question is for the rest of the world, let's say for the Islamic world, you know, if we were Muslims looking at America, To what degree is church and state separated in America, other than in the Constitution? Well, which isn't really in the Constitution, because it didn't come about until 1803 when Jefferson wrote his letter to the Danbury Baptists. It's not codified.
We had an early history in America. A number of the companies were generally bad religious sects.
Yep.
Back to the religion, sorry.
Unitarians soon after, not necessarily. Yeah. And that was the only,
Yeah, Maryland was a Catholic
the only
colony.
religion supported by the state. You had next.
Back to the religion, wisdom question again. I haven't read the Koran. I understand what parallels the Old Testament.
How many of you have read Heart? The vast majority of the company, from my personal reading, the vast majority of the Quran is a lot of sayings.
Oh, it's not because I'm advanced,
Sort of like-
but, you know, if you.
Whoever's talking out there, we can hear you.
What's going on, or you just don't want to get out.
Larry, is that you?
Yeah.
Okay, you're talking. So a lot like the Gospel of Thomas, which didn't take the canonical Gospels, but it's just a long list of sayings. That's a lot of what the Quran is. When it does Abraham and Moses, who they recognize as prophets, and Jesus, then it, by and large, ties in with pretty much the accounts that are in the Bible. I don't think there's any serious disagreements, other than they were men just like Muhammad was.
There are a number of parallel quotations in different parts.
Yeah. The one thing, the one specific that I know about was one time I was doing a sermon on homosexuality in the Bible verses, and you can pretty much totally destroy Bible verses relating to Christianity discriminating against gays and lesbians. The Quran, however, is very explicit. When they talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, it explicitly talks about men having sex with men, 12 times. There is no questioning, at least in 7th century, Arabia, that was a bad thing. So there are some places where it builds onto and enhances. But a Muslim scholar will tell you today that what we call the New Testament was largely written by Paul, who never met Jesus. So they have great respect for Jesus, but I don't think they share any kind of great respect for Paul, which I agree with. So I guess that makes me Muslim.
I think Jesus is second behind Muhammad. Prophets, Muslim.
I'd say that's pretty accurate. Yeah. The other thing that we obviously have in common with Islam is monotheism. There is no debate about Trinity. None. Zero. Allah is one, period. There is no discussion about that. So that's something we share with them. So do we have a sense that there is wisdom we could be gleaning from Islam that we are not currently? And if so, what should we be doing about it? Dennis? I'll let you speak to that question from your experience.
Well, I'm not a religious scholar of any of the Abrahamic religions, but my experience of living in Iran has incited some curiosity about just the cultural practices. And I've seen people from very fundamentalist Muslims being in the street to celebrate the holidays and the recognition of Hussein and Ali, and beating themselves and bringing welts on their back. The very extreme brand to ones that are, highly educated and I don't know if I'd say leaning toward the secular, but accepting the cultural underpinnings of Islam and the search for justice and education that I think are most paramount in the educated classes. Some of the things that have struck me about life in a Muslim country is a degree of respect that people show to each other, social etiquette, and I'm not sure how much that is tied in with their religious teachings or just their practices in the home. I have a sense that a country like Iran, for example, with a long history, has a more sophisticated way of looking at the world and showing discrimination between what a government representative might say and what an individual might say about politics of the day. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all right now. I might be rambling a bit more than I want to, but there are two things that recently I've come to admire about Islam, and that is when Muslims pray, there's a sense of community that is different to me than other religious settings, other prayers that I've seen. When men stand separately from women, I haven't seen men and women praying, but shoulder to shoulder and bowing and putting heads on the ground. It's a kind of a brotherhood that's created that I just don't, a sense of community I don't see in other religions. It's kind of striking to me. And then the sense of during Ramadan, when people are fasting from sunrise to sunset, and at that showing acts of charity to the less well-off for a whole month. I mean, that's a pretty impressive time of year to look at the Muslims' daily practices.
Yeah, and I two things from what your comments too. I was also reminded that the mosques I've been in, by and large, have been very lay-led. Usually the preaching was done by lay people. Maybe that's because we're in this country and there aren't that many imams to go around, but they were certainly comfortable with that, which is something, again, Unitarians would be very comfortable with too. But yeah, Ramadan, and that's a question I'll pose to you all too. I asked the people at the mosque up in Michigan, so what are you all going to do whenever it is? The next World Cup is going to be played in the Middle East, and Ramadan's going to be in June. So it's going to be 110 degrees on those soccer fields. How are your players possibly going to go without water playing, in those conditions? And he carefully explained that, there are, and you're careful to see not rules. There are, practices that you can do that will excuse you for a particular day because of a particular thing, but you make it up later at the end of the month. You'll make that day up. But there, it's an understanding that reality can't always, follow along with doctrine, with dogma. People in hospitals obviously aren't, robbed of water. But they need to make those up. So yeah, I'll pose that question. So, do you think there would be any value? And this is something I've considered before, because a lot of religions have fasting, some definitive practice of the body and mind that focuses one's attention on the spiritual, the religious, whatever one wants to call it, for a particular amount of time, whether it's Lent, or whether it's something as long and seemingly arduous to my standards as Ramadan. Do we see a benefit for that? Is that something we might want to explore, try?
I've seen some articles where they're advocating short times of fasting for people to have, maybe once a week or something, maybe most of the day or something. It's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think a ritual like fasting and maybe meditation can be beneficial. We have such a harried life in this culture. We don't always, we're not as mindful about our values and how we follow them.
And especially, you know, not that I'm advocating going back to blue laws, but you know, when the Sabbath day is no longer not only holy, it's just another day in America. Do we need guidance? Do we need some kind of organization that encourages us to take some time to slow down and just meditate, you know, and just clear our minds of, you know, the day-to-day ridiculousness that we deal with? You know, you're all used to coming to Sunday morning for an hour and 15 minutes and sort of check, that's it, I'm done, you know. Is that enough? Is that enough for you? You feel like that's enough spiritual, whatever you want to call that, support, fertilization of the soil?
My initial response is, EUs around here tend to be so independent of an organized fashion. But I fasted for, not for a continuous year or two, but 2 days, 3 days every month, 2 or 3 continuous days. And I thought it was really an interesting exercise of discipline, just only taking in liquids, cleansing the body. And the interesting to promote, I don't know how you do it in this congregation. You had meditation groups that have 2 people show up. So,
no, and I think Dennis's point, and something as he was saying it, I was like, yeah, my experience has been that too. You know, when you're in wherever you are, when you're praying, it is a very communal activity. And you know, I think that's one of the things the Catholics certainly got right over the years. Is, you know, most ex-Catholics who come to UU churches will tell me the one thing they miss is the rituals. They do miss the sort of community aspect of everyone doing something together. Yeah, we like to think of ourselves as the island of misfit toys. You know, we're all rugged individualists. But does that really, you know, should that preclude us from sacrificing a little bit of that autonomy to doing something, a spiritual practice, together? I'm processing this idea at the same time as you are. I think it's an interesting idea. I just don't know how it, and a congregation like this one would be the perfect one to try it at, because I would think the resistance here would be the greatest. But I would ask the people resisting, okay, explain to me why you're resistant to it.
I think it would depend on what you're wanting done. Otherwise, if it's like a period of time during the service, say for quiet and meditation, that would probably work. But if you were having people doing some catechism, not that, but something, that would give it a lot of resistance.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you're talking about.
And I absolutely get, you know, the resistance to dogma, the resistance to mindless. But if we could ground the practice in something very, you know, physically beneficial, spiritually beneficial, mentally beneficial, is there any reason why we couldn't all agree on something that we would do together, you know, shoulder to shoulder? And I know that would require us touching each other. Oh my God! And one time I had everyone, you know, basically touch each other, and you know, thought I, you know, made them all strip naked. It was like, oh my God, we just don't touch each other up yet. Midwesterners just don't touch each other. I'm like, I'm from the East. I ride the subways. You know, come on, we touch each other all the time. Over that. You know?
You sing together.
You know.
And sometimes it's our response to the thing that you didn't want from wherever it came from. For example, I remember the thing, I had a big thing with the vegetarians, we're gonna eat this thing. I said, wait a minute now, wait a minute. All my life, I've been people telling me when I could eat, what I could eat, and what I couldn't eat, and I ain't gonna take it here
Okay, so I'm going to pick on you, Joe, because I know this is your big bone of contention for you. What would it take to help you accept the importance of the potluck being vegetarian as a spiritual issue? Yeah. As something that this community had agreed to do.
well,
But that's just
Probably.
it, the community didn't agree to it. A committee decreed it.
that's the,
That's it.
yeah.
So if let's say we had a congregational meeting, we had a vote.
We couldn't eat shrimp or something like that.
Yeah.
To say, but some simple thing like
So
that.
let's say we had a vote. Now, we all know we're never going to reach consensus on pretty much anything.
Right.
But what kind of a vote, what percentage would it take before you went, you know what, this isn't a big philosophical issue for me?
And I really could care. As far as food goes, unless it tasted okay, I really couldn't care less. But it's a question of somebody's telling me what I can do and what I can't do. And
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing. The actual act is almost secondary to all the other stuff.
Oh, absolutely.
I take a whole different perspective than Joe. There's 90 meals in a month.
Mhm.
And trying a different style of eating for one meal, I'm open to investigate.
Communally. Not just you, but
Sure.
Mhm.
Right now, I'm trying vegan just because of some issues from my last appointment with the doctor. And said, try this to see how this works. Has anybody ever tried to eat vegan? Now, any animal protein? I'm about 80% there. I stop at that. It's very difficult in this society. But it's an interesting activity to try. See what happens.
like many things that we commit ourselves, like intellectual development, which we are really good at.
Mhm.
Eating vegan is no different. It's just learning the recipes, learning the ritual, having the discipline to doing it. And the vegans I know, the ones that aren't militant jerks, I've known people who've been vegans for 30 years, and they just have the routine down. They know exactly what they're doing. They know why they're doing it, because to them, there is a justice issue behind it of the treatment of animals. And one can poo-poo that and argue, philosophically all they want, but it's a rational decision made for rational reasons, that does make a good deal of, regular sense as well as spiritual sense for them. Now, I agree, could we label our stuff better? Yeah, absolutely. We need to do a way better job of that. Because we got gluten people and we got, vegans that aren't vegetarians and vegetarians that aren't omnivores. I think if I were to suggest something like this, I would say that the potluck should be, we should have some vegan cooks really make sure that we give them, pay for the supplies or whatever, so that they really produce there's some really good vegan dishes. There are vegan dishes out there that you would just kill for.
Like what?
Well, they're not, the best vegan dishes are ones that they're not trying to substitute something that looks like a steak. It's just a totally different meal.
Fun with them like what?
Well, have you ever eaten churras?
Yes.
So like tzatziki sauce. To me, I can put tzatziki sauce on just about anything, and it tastes fantastic. Hummus with baba ganoush, all these kinds of things, lentils and all that. But there are a million spices. If you've ever eaten Ethiopian food, there's a lot of Ethiopian food that's like really tasty, really spicy if you want. Anyway, I'm not here to argue vegan. I'm obviously not a vegan, so.
Nor am I. I'm trying it for blood sugar issues.
But one of my best, dearest friends in seminary is a lifelong vegan. And whenever we would get together at seminary, every week she would at least make one dinner for everybody. And everyone was always just like, wow, Tara, this is just one of the best meals I've ever had. You know?
If you have any questions about that, go online, you'll find some chats on there.
There's a wealth of stuff out there.
Warriors made some beautiful restaurants.
So to wrap up this discussion, so who the hell's in charge of I've just been chided for not going to committees properly. So which committee is in charge of the potluck? The hotties?
Yes, but they didn't make that decision. They didn't make that rule. It was the social justice people that imposed it on the.
It's Green Sanctuary.
So Green Sanctuary.
Okay, Green Sanctuary, okay.
Okay, so how about if I get Green Sanctuary and the hotties together, and we flesh this out a little bit and see what comes of it? Is that something you know that people could agree on, rather than agree? Well, we're good at agreeing to disagree. Sure. Can we agree to agree?
Yeah. Joe wants to say something. So,
Not me.
Well, we'll work on YouTube.
I think it could be beneficial.
Yeah.
There's nothing worse than when there's like, believe me.
I mean, yeah, and I'll agree with you. There is nothing worse than the fake meats that they sell in grocery places. And those things, please don't ever use those as a way of judging vegan food. They're awful.
When you come to potluck, you could eat vegan if you want. There's plenty of it there. That's a choice. So,
And I can see why it came from Green Sanctuary, because there is that kind of social justice element to it. Okay, so let's move on to Hinduism. Again, I have a good article on that. I'll send you the link to it. Yuga ministers were reading Hindu works in the late 18th century and early 19th century. Joseph Priestley, who we all know is the discoverer of oxygen, right? You know, he identified oxygen, who was also a Unitarian minister, was particularly fond of Hindu writings. John Adams, and he gave John Adams information on how to, what sources to read and all that. And that helped ignite a broad American interest in what was then called Oriental thought. Please don't use that word anymore. It's one of those verboten words. Emerson then really took it on and wove Hindu ideas into transcendentalism. They don't really have sacred texts per se. There's no Bible equivalent. There's no Quran equivalent. They have big epic stories, and they have songs. So the Vedas go back to 2500 BCE. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana go back several millennia. The Bhagavad Gita is the one most people have heard of. It's a little tiny piece of the Mahabharata, and that's the one in particular that Emerson was very fond of, was the Bhagavad Gita. And then after Emerson and after the Transcendentalists, there were several individuals, such as Tagore, Swami Vivekananda, and obviously Gandhi. Tagore and Vivekananda are around the turn of the century, and these were Hindus who came to this country and toured, basically. And we interacted a lot with them. There were a lot of Unitarian Universalists interacting with these various Hindu leaders in the early 1900s. And then, of course, Gandhi comes along and basically becomes a harem of social justice and as well as near ascetic living and all those kinds of things that could be part of Hindu theology. So, for us, the question then is, the questions are, I'll add this too. I found this quote, which I thought was really good. So this guy, Eric Sharp, wrote a book called The Universal Gita. And he said, one of the dilemmas of the Unitarian response to Hinduism is this. I'm going to read, I normally don't read slides, but I'm going to read this because this is really good. In the post-Enlightenment period, there arose an almost universal conviction that in matters of religion, words and texts are of supreme importance. The underlying assumption was that the world as a whole ought to read its own sacred scriptures, and that these could be understood by anyone who cared to read them, and that their having originally had a far different religious and cultural setting than that of the modern West need not be a barrier to their appropriation. So this assumption, post-Enlightenment, which I think still really goes into today, that if I want to understand Hinduism, all I got to do is read the Bhagavad Gita, and I'll get it, or just read some online documents, or if I'm Hindu, if I'm a Muslim, if I read the Quran, I'll get Islam. And when an entire religious tradition makes this assumption, then, and in the name of diversity, which is something we talk about a lot in our churches, then the tradition runs the considerable risk of misunderstanding the significance of the genuine cultural and religious diversity. So our questions then are, do we do a sufficient job of educating ourselves when we use texts of other religions in our worship services? And if we are truly interested in diversifying our worship, what do we need to do more of or differently in order to avoid that kind of misappropriation?
Not up to the minister.
Is it?
We would be studying these things.
In order to understand the text, you'd almost have to understand the culture around it, and that's a whole different factor.
And that's a very modern interpretation.
Hmm.
Up until just a few decades ago, that wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have been able to say that and just
It would be a
nod your heads.
fundamentalist would have been just a fundamentalist type of thing. Just the text says this. But
Is it just up to the minister? I mean, obviously, I guess that's the question, what if you're a lay-like congregation? Then whose job is it? But do you trust me to just make that call for y'all?
Well, we've trusted the publishers of the hymnals who drove together samples.
Mm-hmm.
We trust that collection.
Should we?
Well, I have chosen to.
Mm-hmm.
We would be interpreting the words from a Unitarian perspective instead of the culturally appropriate original perspective. Why would we stand? Why wouldn't that just be a solution? You don't have to know this.
Then why do we change the words to hymns?
Why do we-
Why do we change the words to other people's hymns?
If we're not quite happy with those words, we rearrange them. And I expect we're going to be giving some pronouncements from the pulpit. They better be the words we understand and are appropriate for us, or there better be a big explanation about it. I don't see just dabbling in somebody else's religion as appropriate, unless it has something for your own.
We like the tune, but we don't like we've left the words behind.
Okay.
We're familiar with the cultural derivation of the words that were written, and we have chosen to disagree.
Okay.
mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that that is a choice, by and large, that the churches of this association have chosen to do. I don't think there are any of our churches that don't use the teal hymnal, or the gray hymnal. The teal hymnal is less of a problem because there's almost no traditional songs in there, but the gray hymnal is filled with them.
And for Americans, I guess that's the easiest, lazy man's way to ease into Unitarian Universalism and not feel like you're that far estranged, because the hymns that have been written specifically for use in the opera hymnal, because Unitarian churches tend not to have song leaders, ministers of music, quote unquote, like a lot of other religions that we are familiar with in America, then those hymns never get learned. They have to be taught.
That's right.
Which I have had, noticed for a long time that is a drawback of this church and several other union churches.
And you know, you raise an excellent point there. You know, we obviously have no problem reinventing the religious education of our children. We don't take generally Christian curricula and then just adapt them. But when I sing "Forward through the ages in unbroken line," I'm sorry, that is Onward Christian Soldiers. I mean, you can paint that dog, but it's still the original color.
I like it much better.
I know, and I agree with you. I like the tune, and you know, and when you know, we can easily say, well, who are we hurting? You know,
Well,
there's
Christians should be, you know, rolling over about those lyrics too, Onward Christian
that's
Soldiers.
right. Yeah, they should.
I know in the previous church, you know, I was guy, so I couldn't sing the theology that was in the songs.
Yeah.
So I like to hear it, like to sing the theology.
Looking at that first, not to get over technical, but this is just me and that. What is a sufficient job? How would we know what's sufficient? I mean,
No, that's an
I
excellent
don't think
question.
there's any two people in this room that would agree on what's sufficient. How much knowledge should I have? If we do use the text, it's a given, I think, that we use the text of other service, of other religions and serve. That's a given. Okay, you gotta do that. Now, what should I come away with? How much should I know?
What would constitute a sufficient job? That's an excellent question.
Now, I've been thinking is, I was raised in the Christian church from the 4 or 5 different denominations through my life. But typically in a service, you have the Old Testament, the New Testament, and that's a guide towards the sermon. It's going to be connected. Usually the New Testament
There's
sometimes.
a lectionary.
Yeah. In the Unitarian church, I'm making this up, I don't know what's happening, is here's what I want to talk about. Now, what kind of text
Exactly.
can it,
That's exactly how
it could be Hindu, it could be, and so it's so diverse. You know, in the Christian church, at least you're pointing at the Bible every week. In the UU church, it's all over the place.
Yep.
How can you do a sufficient job? You're just touching various things.
So maybe it would be easier to answer the question, what would constitute an insufficient job? What would constitute an example of gross misappropriation?
Well, no, I really don't. I think you take from other religions what you want, and you leave the rest of it is so not useful. And some religions you can't get anything from very likely. You know, take Scientology or some crazy ass thing like that. So you know, we're picking and choosing. We chose to pick and choose. I think that's the way it is. We're not practicing all the religions in the world. We're not melding all the religions in the world together. You know, and besides, all those are theistic religions, and so I got a real problem right there. You know, and there's good sayings in probably many of them. You know, I prefer like Jesus' idea of don't cast the first stone unless you're without sin. You know. There's lots of things to pick up on, but they have to come within a Unitarian viewpoint rather than the original, which sometimes would be the same. But we don't have to know the original.
Right, it
We're
becomes-
crazy trying to learn all
With
that.
us becomes determined on really what the minister's kind of trend is.
Yes.
I mean, you know, how many people have heard of Paulo Freire? You know, I mean, I have, because that's my bent. But I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
You pick those types of things.
Go ahead, Pat.
Well, I'm just curious, where did the turquoise hymnal come from? When
The old one or the new one?
The turquoise, the new one.
The new one.
The new one? I'm sure there was a commission of musicians put together, and I mean, a lot of the songs in that particular hymnal were written by musicians.
'Cause I personally find those songs, and I don't carry a tune very well to begin with, but I find those songs really impossible. And I just shut up.
See, we have the top, and actually, whenever you go to a GA, you're taught those songs, so they really aren't.
Mhm.
Some of them really are difficult in, in your head. But there are a lot of them, like Blue Boat Home is just absolutely beautiful.
It's a favorite of every
It's
country.
a favorite of every GA that there ever is. So we're just not taught those songs. We need a song. I thought we need a song leader.
Okay.
Go back to your question.
What we, excuse me, what we need is a committee to pick certain notes.
No, we don't. Oh, God, no.
Back to your question. In the use of other writings, it's used, I think, when it is used, it's illustrative of a particular point you're making, that you can accept or not accept, as opposed to saying doctrine that you have to accept. That's the difference.
So we've heard John's position that John says there is nothing that is ever going to constitute gross misappropriation. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Can anyone think of an example that would constitute gross misappropriation? That even you would be like, ouch, we shouldn't be doing that.
How about serving communion?
But we do communions. We do flower
I
communion.
know, but
We do apple communion. Should we even be using that word?
no, I don't think so.
Now, I think a word is a word. A word is just a collection of letters.
Mhm.
But, how would people feel if I did a sermon on the devotional aspects of religion, and I used as an example of that during it the whole communion ritual, using the Catholic,
Mhm.
as an example to people
It's a
who have
feast,
never
a food
experienced it.
feast, basically, that's what it is.
Right.
Both ways or another, it's an extension
And I
of Jewish
used
to
consecrated
Christian.
host and blessed wine, the whole thing. Would that be right?
You mean as a sermon or as?
That's part of the worship
It's a
service.
ritual.
Worship.
It's fine. They wouldn't care. They never know about it. You
I think
do what you want to do. It's a free country.
I think there would be a problem for people to accept that. I think you can discuss it and you can talk about it. If you want, now we're serving communion, which is it doesn't fit in with the thinking of the congregation, most of the people in the congregation, maybe some it does. I mean, there's some congregations that have the prayer, book of common prayer, but that's few and far between, I think. But for most of the people to say, okay, now we're going to have communion, and it's like the Christian idea of communion, it would just not be accepted. But if you talk about it, so there's a presentation of certain ideas from it, I think that would be accepted.
So now let me address. So I'm going to concede, not agree, but I'm going to concede a few of John's points, for narrowing this down. You might care what Catholics think about what I do in my worship services. No, I don't really process it too much. There's millions of them, and okay. So what if I did a worship service on native spirituality, and I put on a headdress and the robe, and I danced around in a circle doing an Indian ritual? Would that be appropriate?
I thought of that a minute ago, and we worried me.
Because they care.
I think we had recently,
Voodoo, the voodoo guy, the big 12 guy with the voodoo priest, that voodoo priest. Yeah.
There's a woman, sure, I forget who this is.
Oh, yeah. But
somebody
even more extreme was the voodoo priest here. Don't you remember? He had a crescent right, he's like 7 foot high, you couldn't miss him. Yeah.
But what we're doing is inviting outside guests.
Yeah.
We have a
That's
minister from the Christian church who's very
John
good.
Hall.
Yeah, and we brought in, I forget, numerous different people, but it's not the minister.
Right.
It's
Mhm.
representations of other religions coming in. It's not going to be you. I think people get a little more upset if you put on your headdress or declare Israelis or
John's one preaching Christian doctrine.
And let's presume I'm a really good dancer and I'm attractive in a loincloth. But notwithstanding, no, any minister that does, any UU minister that does that needs to go back to seminary. That would just be categorically wrong on every level. And I would hypothesize that I think congregations should feel the same way. That if that happens, whether it's the minister or whether it's a layperson, let's say, let's use it like Dennis as an example. Let's say someone lived overseas in another country. Let's say they lived in Japan, and they come over here and they do a Shinto ritual. They're not Shinto. They just watched it a bunch of times and read some books.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no Shinto followers probably within 5 miles of this building, but should we still object to it because of appropriation? Or a better question, is there a better way to do it other than us just assuming we have permission to do it?
There must be. Because it seems like people are becoming more aware of the white privilege of just accepting or misappropriating any cultural thing they want to.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how
And we need to be more sensitive to that. And I think it's up to the churches, especially Unitarians, because sometimes I think Unitarians are typecast as really strange because they don't worship God.
Right.
And some people are family. So
And actually, brings up a point there that kind of ties in with this one. There are Unitarian Universalists that worship God,
Mm-hmm.
and they worship that God. It's not Allah, it's not Yeshua, it's not, it's not any of those gods by name, but to them it's the same God because we all worship the same God in their minds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in some congregations, those people are pariahs, and they eventually leave because they just find themselves so unwelcome that they can't stay.
But if you brought the Boston Unitarian ritual and enacted it in here, I mean, I read that thing. I said, geez, they stole the copyrights. I mean, that's even with it,
Yep.
you still get a difference between misappropriation, which is this whole, I say that compared to taking some idea and maybe mangling that thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not mocking, because that would not be Unitarian.
Well,
We're not
We're not
presuming that we
denigrating,
understand.
We're
it
not
completely.
trying to use it inappropriately. We're trying to use it as an example of something new. So I don't think that's misappropriation.
No, and I would agree with you. Just as it would be wildly inappropriate for us to use this fasting thing as a way to, we're going to fast for a day to understand how people who are hungry feel.
Yeah.
Good God, walk in plates. But there are people that would think that's a wonderful idea.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is there a way to do that? Yeah, I think there are ways to do that. I saw online like 2 years ago, this guy decided to live as long as he could on the rations that Syrian refugees were getting in Turkey or someplace. And it was a little box with a handful of lentils, and he said after a week he couldn't take it. He was starting to, mind was going, he couldn't concentrate, his body, 50% of his energy was gone because there was nothing fresh in it. And he said he would really try, he thought he was going to be able to do this for a long time, but he's like, these people, and he said, and I knew I was going to be done. I could quit anytime. They're going to be here for years. Now, I don't think that's misappropriation. I think that's an attempt to truly understand. But it could very easily become something that it would be a bad thing. It's something I will invite. If you ever feel I have misappropriated something, please call me out on it, because sometimes I just generally don't know. I have a colleague out in Oregon who is really into Western African drum rhythms. And he told me many, many years ago, and I didn't do anything bad, but she was telling me this, the author, each rhythm has an author. And although there's no legal paper stuff, those rhythms are owned. And you don't use another guy's rhythm without their permission. And so she, when I asked her about, well, does that mean you just don't play certain rhythms? She goes, yeah, I mean, I know the rhythm, but I won't perform it because it's not mine to perform. Another example, which is hilarious, I really like the Zuni Indians. It's a small tribe in Mexico. There was a guy, Frank Cushing was his name. He went to live with the Zunis in the 60s, 70s, somewhere in there. And he lived with them for several years. And he felt that he had acquired enough information that he could write a book about my life with the Zunis, and here's what the Zunis are all about. And after he died, people went back later, sociologists and whatever, and they were like, well, what do you think of Cushing's book? And they just rolled on the floor laughing. They said, yeah, he got through the first level of stuff, but we've got 10 levels, and he wasn't allowed to see any of that stuff. He thought he knew all about us, but we were just accommodating the white guy and making him feel happy. So it's something where I think we've always got to ask ourselves the question. We may go ahead and do 99% thinking of it, but we should always ask the question: is what we're doing appropriate?
Like about 15 or 20 years ago, it was a big thing for Unitarians up and down the Atlantic coast to have sweat lodges.
Mm.
And almost every, well, it was very prominent. It was very common in the DC area. They would build their own little sweat lodges and have classes on them, and it was done at lots and lots of places.
Yeah.
Church retreats and regional retreats and district retreats and
I think if you had a discussion about it, it could be completely divorced from indigenous practices. I mean, the Finns would say they do sweat lodges because everybody's got a freaking sauna in their house. For them, it's health and well-being and all of that. But yeah, I can well imagine that some churches did it very badly and probably included some drumming and chants. That,
oh hell yeah!
Yeah,
it's a whole experience. Yeah.
And that's one where you never know who in your congregation is 50% Indian. And they may be like, and you may just lose that person and they never come back and you never know why. And we may say, well, they weren't going to be happy here anyway. Well, maybe we're the ones that should be uncomfortable, So now let's go to our last example. Buddhism. Buddhism came over here in the late 1700s with all the seafaring types coming into New England, and they would bring examples with them. It took a little longer for Buddhism to take hold in terms of interest. The first exploration of it published was in The Dial, which was the Transcendentalist magazine. It was unattributed, so it wasn't, and everyone assumed Thoreau wrote it, but later it was discovered Elizabeth Peabody actually wrote it. But Thoreau was huge on Buddhism. It was widely understood that he considered himself Buddhist, and that he felt the Buddha was a spiritual teacher of equal par with Jesus. Buddhism has a rich set of spiritual technologies of prayer, meditation, all that sort of thing. And here we have the issue of this is not a theistic religion. So, now the misappropriation thing maybe has a little less concern for us because it's not, most Buddhists I know who are Western Buddhists, so they probably don't count. But in India, I think a lot of Buddhists would be like, yeah, you want to use it, knock yourself out. It's not a sacred thing to us. It's just what we do. So there might be a lot less problem with that. I came across this very cool story. Let's see if I can find it quick here. Where did I put it? So this is an article that was written by James Ishmael Ford. If you know Buddhism and Unitarian Universalism, James Ford is the guy. He's a UU minister. He has long been a leading Buddhist in our movement. He's part of the Buddhists. I forget what the Buddhist group in UU circles is called. He's always been involved in that.
Where's his church?
Where is he now? He's been around a lot of places. I think he's in California now. I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure. Yeah, okay, here it is. So, and this is one of the big differences between Buddhism and certainly Hinduism. While there was a lot of flow to us from Hinduism, there was very little flow back. I mean, very little of what any Hindus learned here made it back to India and changed anything. Buddhism, on the other hand, had a lot of exchange, and there was a lot of expanded perceptions within each religious community. An example of this was there was a story of this Nakahama Manjiro. In 1841, he was caught up in a storm and swept out to sea. He was with a bunch of Japanese fishermen. They were rescued by a New Bedford whaler. The crew was dropped off in Hawaii except for Nakahama. The captain found the boy's intelligence and curiosity and everything about him fascinating. And so the captain took Nakahama into his personal care, brought him back to Massachusetts, but he found that his Methodist church wouldn't allow a colored in, but he said they probably didn't use the word colored. So they joined a Unitarian congregation. And after a life of a very successful life here, he became a whaler. He was later a gold prospector. He finally gathered enough wealth to return to Japan after only a decade. And once back in Japan, he endured the long-established test in Japan trying to prevent Christians from coming over, because now he was being viewed as the Christian. In fact, it says that there was a picture of the Virgin Mary put in the ground, and he had to stomp on it. He said, and of course, he had no problem with that at all. You know, he rose to great fame and fortune in Japan. He was invited to the imperial court, and eventually was even raised to the rank of samurai. In 1868, he was part of the revolt that established the new emperor. Many of his disciples were recruited into leadership. So the writer of this story, draws this very direct line to, this is an example where Unitarianism had a very direct impact on the culture that it was taken back to by a member of that society. So our relationship with Buddhism is very, very interesting. Another thing that you see with Buddhism is one of the developments of Western Buddhism is the social justice aspect. Asian Buddhism is fairly shrugging shoulders about it. It's just sort of innate that you're going to take care of the earth because it's all one. But specifically going out and doing just works isn't necessarily a Buddhist thing. In this country it is. So Asian Buddhism is actually learning from the West what it is like to incorporate social justice as part of your theology, which I think is pretty cool. There are a lot of books on Western Buddhism and its impact. So the question for you, what are the pros and cons of opening ourselves to such an exchange with other religions with the potential to change both?
I wonder if we're not there already. If you're going to be incorporating stories, sayings from other religions, and there's a connection there. If you want to dig deeper, you have to learn more about that religion. I suppose there's something worthwhile to discover in just about any of them. So,
and you're talking about at least two people, one on one side, one on the other. And then they have some dialogue and a willingness to converse back and forth. And then there may come out of that a better understanding of each other and perhaps some changes, not necessarily in the religion, but in some viewpoints and so forth. But if you're talking about just studying a religion with the idea of changing religion without having that intercourse between people, it's not going to happen.
Has it happened? Has it happened for Unitarian Universalists? I mean, can you think of any examples in this church where exposure to other religions has changed the way you do anything?
Period where the congregation meditate and so forth.
Well, I mean, I would say on a one-time thing or an occasion, no. But, like, for instance, I don't know how many of you have noticed, when I'm done with the sermon, the next thing in the order of service is listed as prayerful meditation. And I begin with Spirit of life and love that we know in many names, and now within a period of prayer, reflection, and meditation. And I very specifically use all three of those words. Now, maybe that's a real easy to slide in cultural change. But I'm sure the first time anyone heard me say that here, they were probably like, prayer? We don't pray here. I'm sure there was some immediate like, and so my thing is just, it's a word. All reflection, all meditation. I'm not asking you to kneel. I'm not asking you to hold your hands, look to the sky, look to the ground. Do what you do. So that would be an example of a very small, in my opinion, change of our culture if we did more of that. But I get the feedback. I mean, every time we do anything that's remotely, spiritual, where it's asking you to do something a little beyond the normal, like a guided meditation or something like that. There's always a little bit of,
Depends on what people think of as spiritual.
Right.
Well, there's the UU church or the UU group of us. But individually, I mean, the way I got here, the way many of us got here was through a long, protracted, for most of us, search that led me through different religions where I studied each one of those and rejected.
So you're absolutely right. So let me close the elephant in the room on that.
Okay.
I would say we've experienced this twice as a denomination. I mean, obviously every church can do its own thing. Congregational polity. If you guys want to start a Wiccan coven and every member of the church has to belong to it, you're perfectly allowed to do that. There's nothing wrong with it. But you'll be nearly alone. But I would say that we have twice experienced the very real or perceived change in the way the denomination is going in the last century.
And more.
How are we different from what this church would have been 150 years ago? I mean, when a person right. We are not a Christian church by any stretch of the imagination. And we probably barely have, maybe 5% of our members will say they identify as Christian. More might say that they are followers of Jesus, which is what I say about myself. But still, it's not anything like it would have been 150 years ago. So that change came about largely over time, well, a number of influences, but largely from the Humanist Manifesto in 1933 and the ensuing decades of various iterations of free thinkers, ethical culturalists, that sort of thing. So I think that's one where we had exposure to not necessarily another religion, or I suppose that would be a very interesting conversation to have, is humanism or religion. No, I'm not going to touch that one. But it's been a severe change of the culture of our denomination. Now, in response to that, we've had an equal, I wouldn't say equal yet, although I think humanist is, a response of the spiritual people back in the last 10, 15 years. And so now you have this, in my opinion, very unfortunate, often vitriolic debate between, the so-called humanist theist debate, which I think is very mislabeled. I wish we could get away from white-black duality of it. But it has reached the stage where, certainly we ministers are always a little treading on glass, worried that we're going to do something too theistic or something just too humanist and please everyone. So those are, I think those are the two big cultural changes in Unitarian Universalism in the last century.
Well, then there's the whole female aspect.
Okay, say more.
Well, I can only speak for myself as a woman. Part of the reason I rejected so many of those religions I researched was because I, not a little bit, but a whole lot, hated their prescription for women in church as spiritual beings, etc. Go on and on and on and on. So I think in the last 200 years that Unitarian vision of women's role, women's spirituality, whatever, has diverged in a way that there's no going back.
And that change happened, it certainly began happening in the 1870s.
Yes.
I mean, there were women Unitarian ministers even in the 1700s.
Yes.
But Olympia Brown and people like that, the late 1800s, certainly you're the first ordained women who were ordained by our faith, not by some other faith. And a lot of it happened because of the spread across America. So you had fellowships starting up in nowhere places in Iowa, and no man wanted to take the position, so the woman would take it. And that's where the women earned their chops, was taking these frontier positions in churches, which is awesome. If you read their stories, it's great reading. We have been exceptionally bad at people of color on that same front. Black ministers in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the UUA, the AUA and the Universal Church Movement did a particularly bad job of supporting black ministers. And some would say we still do a pretty lousy job of it. I think we can do a lot better. But yeah, that is a cultural change that it came really naturally to us too, since the whole suffrage movement from its inception was largely fueled by Unitarians. So when we look at the cost,
So when I look at the religions, there's not really a whole lot there that has light to our own, except some spiritual rituals.
and I think the here, whereas in Islam and certainly Hinduism, we were talking about appropriation of practices or of a ritual. But here now we're really talking about the appropriation of a philosophy, of an idea. And with Buddhism, you definitely have that. When someone calls themselves a Buddhist Unitarian Universalist, you can generally assume that person has a very different cosmic worldview than what I would say the average Unitarian Universalist has. They have accepted, that sort of mindset, which is one that I would say is generally shared in the Buddhist theology, if you can call it theology without God. So I think that maybe that's where we can look at this. Are there ways of being religious? Whether it's, you know, of the four we always talk about. You know, is there a devotional way of being religious? Is there a karmic, you know, way of acting that would be different? That we would be willing to explore, certainly as individuals, but maybe even as congregations. One I've always been waiting for is I want to see the congregation just do Jnana Yoga crazy, you know, like researching stuff like mad and producing their own books and things like that. And largely that, we had ministers doing that in the 40s and 50s. You know, some of my favorites, like Paul Davies, were constantly publishing stuff in big collections and things. The humanist ministers have been great at that. But I'd love to see our congregation do it. Like, you know, like maybe we commit to a social justice project for the year, and then we also commit to, here's an intellectual project we're going to commit to for a year. Like if we were going to do that democracy thing for social justice, I think we should also be doing at the same time, and, you know, a philosophical discussion of when we say we believe in the democratic process, what the hell does that mean? And what do we mean when we say it, and what maybe should it mean that it doesn't? And really explore that issue hard. Don't get away from all this flowery ambiguous language. I don't know. And maybe at the end come up with a congregational vote of some kind of a stand. You know, this is what it means to us to be a church that stands on democratic processes.
You're a very shaky man to assume that you can be involved in social justice action without understanding that you
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. Especially on certain issues.
the thing that you
Yeah. In fact, I was just talking with the executive committee of the board today. You know, I have said in the past, you have a wonderful opportunity here to delve into racial justice issues, given that, in my experience, I've been in a lot of cities. This is one of the most segregated cities I've ever been in. I don't think it's violently segregated, or I think it's culturally segregated.
No, it's geographically.
Yeah, and geographic. So I think that provides a wonderful opportunity to address racial and economic justice issues here. Do I think this church is ready to delve into that? Hell no. You're certainly not going to be ready, but it's unlikely. This is going to be all. If you wanted to do that, it's a very long-term process of getting yourself to the point where you would be able to even approach those communities and ask them what they would like, you know, in the way of help or assistance, and they may just say, "There's nothing you can do for us. You know, just sit down and shut up and eat with us. You know, just recognize us as human beings." Because we always come at it from this solve the problem issue, and that's like, no, we'll solve our own problems. We know what we need to do. We just need bodies to help with it. So, yeah, John, you're absolutely right. You know? And that's why I think we do something like this. We need to start on something that we already had a collective, pretty strong understanding of what we were talking about. And if not, do some kind of very quick. You know, it was something you could learn quickly to, you know, expose yourself to the necessary. Like, I don't think we all have to read the Tocqueville, but you know, I think we could all kind of come up to speed on democracy. And you know, I always have people say, "The United States isn't a democracy." I'm like, okay, yeah, fine, it's a republic involved. You know, I get that all the time from people, and I'm like, yeah. Let's argue over the words. Let's argue over the meaning. The important thing is, where are we getting at here?
I think an issue like race, which has dominated our whole history, and most of us don't understand that the average Unitarian wouldn't even know what race means. They know culturally what it means, and they think that's what it really means, but they don't know what race means. I mean, it's the amount of work necessary to get people to understand what's going on so that they will have harbor, I guess, a less, I'll call it, the first thing to say is prejudice, but it's it's a misunderstanding. The thing is very effective without really.
Yeah, and I mean, like this last Sunday when Russ did his thing on the Me Too movement and compassionate, yeah, I mean, that's us educating us, yeah, us guys, needing to educate ourselves about women and what role do we play in oppressing women, in objectifying them, and what are things that we, and you can't go to the women and say, tell us what we're doing that no, you need to figure it out for yourself. Put yourself in the other person's shoes and go, wow, I'm an asshole. I should stop doing it. Because of our privilege. And women similarly have the same kind of privilege when it comes to people of color, or maybe economic position, or any one of them. Class. These are all things that we all can educate ourselves on better. And it's way too much to do any more than one of them at a time, probably. Like you guys did the Welcoming Congregation program some years ago. Have you done anything since? How many gays and lesbians are here? Do we even have a presence in the? I'm just asking questions. I don't know the answer. How much of a presence do we have in the LGBT community? Should it be more? And those are questions you need to ask yourself all the time. Are we living our principles? Are we living into those principles that we, some churches recite the principles every week. My old church in Pittsburgh did. That was, the opening words were always reading the principles, or saying the principles. Now, if I tried that here, I don't know, what would people think of that? Would people think I'm... Well, don't get me started on Joyce and I have my opinion on Joyce concerns. I'm going to keep my mouth shut about it. So far, the changes that I suggested have gone without public outcry, which is better than I've had in other churches. I've had great gnashing of teeth and rending of garments in other churches. Yet this is a practice that no other denomination does.
Right.
Not one other denomination that I know of that does anything remotely like the way we do Joys and Concerns as part of their worship service. Why?
I don't care.
No,
It's the way we've always done it.
It's
No,
time consuming.
Right, it is.
It's not simple for everybody.
And I would argue, and I'll just say this briefly and shut up because we're out of time. I think we do this because it's all about us.
Yes.
It's not about the community. It's not about the denomination. It's about me.
That's about the local.
Yeah. And
church.
not that that's a bad thing.
Well, no,
But
wait
it's
a
a-
minute, it's about my wife's cousin's neighbor's dog.
But it's a decision you've made, either by omission or commission. And one that I put out there as, well, maybe you want to make a conscious decision. Here, we want to do this for these and these and these reasons. Understanding that doing it means we're doing this. Rather than just, well, that's normal. It's not normal. It's normal with it. Well, it's somewhat normal among Unitarian Universalist churches, but you're right at the size where it starts getting hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could easily.
We have been for 20 years.
I mean, we had 2 Sundays in January where they went on for 15 minutes, and that's.
Yes.
I can't plan a worship service if I have a
Right.
pocket in there that could be 5 minutes or 15 minutes. I
Right.
just can't do it. And I'm not going to cut my sermon. I'm sorry, I worked too damn hard on it. I'm not cutting my sermons. If the sermon goes on for 15 minutes, you all are going to be here till 11:15 or 11 or
Back on
12:15,
track. I
12:30.
would very much like to have us read the principles every Sunday.
So we are out of time.
Or 1:23, whatever.
So let's extinguish our chalice in unison with this reading. No matter where our path leads, we are unfragmented and undivided. Awakened to this wholeness, there is no such thing as a stranger. To truly wish someone well, to make of our lives a peaceful, joyous place. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.